in the study of slavery and the study of these movements for civil rights in the 1960s and 70s, we're really good at protecting ideas, really not great at protecting people. And that goes for white, cis, heterosexual men as well. We're really bad at protecting our veterans. We're really bad at protecting our citizens through the healthcare system. We're protecting an idea to the deficit of our own health and connection with each other. Then we're not being present to what's actually happening. And that is a willful ignorance that radical Dharma is meant to disrupt.
Welcome back to Unbroken Chain. I'm Mara James, and this week we get to hang out with Dr. Jasmine Syedullah. She not only has the best laugh in the whole entire world, she is a masterclass in Radical Dharma, which also is the name of the book that she co-authored in 2016, Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation, which she unpacks in many ways in this conversation, but it is so worth the deep dive. Jasmine is so eloquent, she's whip smart, and she's deeply compassionate, and that combination right now feels like salvation. This conversation gave me so much hope, but also really concrete tools that I know that I and so many people are hungry for right now. I feel like I'm at the beginning of my work of really understanding what abolition looks like, what transformative justice means, and Jasmine helped me anchor that education in really personal, practical practice that is available to all of us. And that was a total game changer for me. We have the power always to shape our perception of the world, and most importantly from that, we have the power to respond. We have the power of our own reaction. So for anyone right now that is feeling particularly paralyzed by the institutions around us that perpetuate injustice and violence and how much their power is being reinforced, Jasmine really helped me see how humans give power to the ideologies that reinforce those institutions. And humans, starting with myself, can dismantle them by starting to dismantle the ideologies that we have internalized, often without our full awareness. And that just continually blew my mind. I was laughing at myself editing this conversation because you can hear me just murmuring along in agreement. And really, I was just so blown away by Jasmine's really powerful self-awareness and clarity about how we can proceed in what feel to me very often like very unclear times. She is one of those spirits that's out there at the edge of the map where it's not rendered yet with the lantern and pointing us towards somewhere way better than we've been. And the more that we all join that and walk those paths, it becomes a road. And the dream of justice is not just a dream for those that are embodying it in their relationships every day. Jasmine illustrates that that is available for practice right now with our families, our coworkers, our neighbors, ourselves. And that's not a minimization of the work that needs to be done to transform our world into a just world. That is the work. Before we dive into the conversation with her, I want to kick us off with Assata Shakur in her own words. I want to play for you an excerpt of an open letter that she wrote to Pope Francis in 1998, which was aired by Democracy Now! This letter came about because she was in Cuba under political asylum, and New Jersey state troopers had reached out to ask the Pope to extradite her to the United States. So this is her response to why he should actually be protecting her. She gives in this a brief account of her lifelong fight for justice for the most vulnerable in America, and really provides some context for the deeply and just inextricably personal work of reform and justice. This is the reality that we are struggling as a nation, as a people, to hold, and that Jasmine is offering us tools to be able to take on as our responsibility for our own freedom. just as much as for the freedom of the most vulnerable. So here's Assata Shakur in 1998.
My name is Assata Shakur, and I was born and raised in the United States. I am a descendant of Africans who were kidnapped and brought to the Americas as slaves. I spent my early childhood in the racist, segregated South. I later moved to the northern part of the country, where I realized that black people were equally victimized by racism and oppression. I grew up and became a political activist, participating in student struggles, the anti-war movement, and most of all, in the movement for the liberation of African Americans in the United States. I later joined the Black Panther Party, an organization that was targeted by the COINTELPRO program, a program that was set up by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to eliminate all political opposition to the U.S. government's policies, to destroy the black liberation movement in the United States, to discredit activists, and to eliminate potential leaders. Under the COINTELPRO program, many political activists were harassed, imprisoned, murdered, or otherwise neutralized. As a result of being targeted by COINTELPRO, I, like many other young people, was faced with the threat of prison, underground, exile, or death. The FBI, with the help of local police agencies, systematically fed false accusations and fake news articles to the press, accusing me and other activists of crimes we did not commit. Although in my case the charges were eventually dropped or I was eventually acquitted, the national and local police agencies created a situation where, based on their false accusations against me, any police officer could shoot me on sight. It was not until the Freedom of Information Act was passed in the mid-'70s that we began to see the scope of the United States government's persecution of political activists. At this point, I think that it is important to make one thing very clear. I have advocated, and I still advocate, revolutionary changes in the structure and in the principles that govern the United States. I advocate self-determination for my people and for all oppressed people inside the United States. I advocate an end to capitalist exploitation, the abolition of racist policies, the eradication of sexism, and the elimination of political repression. If that is a crime, then I am totally guilty. To make a long story short, I was captured in New Jersey in 1973 after being shot with both arms held in the air and then shot again from the back. I was left on the ground to die, and when I did not, I was taken to a local hospital where I was threatened, beaten, and tortured. In 1977, I was convicted in a trial that can only be described as a legal lynching. In 1979, I was able to escape with the aid of some of my fellow comrades. I saw this as a necessary step, not only because I was innocent of the charges against me, but because I knew that the racist legal system in the United States, I would receive no justice. I was also afraid that I would be murdered in prison. I later arrived in Cuba, where I am currently living in exile as a political refugee. The New Jersey State Police and other law enforcement officials say they want to see me brought to justice. But I would like to know what they mean by justice. Is torture justice? I was kept in solitary confinement for more than 2 years, mostly in men's prisons. Is that justice? My lawyers were threatened with imprisonment, and imprisoned. Is that justice? I was tried by an all-white jury without even the pretext of impartiality and then sentenced to life in prison plus 33 years. Is that justice? Let me emphasize that justice for me is not the issue I am addressing here. It is justice for my people that is at stake. When my people receive justice, I am sure that I will receive it too.
Thank you, Assata. And here, in her own words, is Dr. Jasmine Syedullah picking right up.
My name is Dr. Jasmine Syedullah, and I am here at Vassar College. I'm in the visiting assistant professor position in sociology currently, but we'll be shifting this summer into a tenure track line in Africana Studies with a focus in prison studies, for which I'm very grateful. So I have a very interdisciplinary background, pulling from feminist studies, political theory, religion, English, and sociology.
She's got it all.
Yeah. You need a lot of different methods to study intersectionality, so it's been really useful to have these deep dives in these different institutional settings into different disciplinary formations. It's definitely made my teaching and research more rich.
I bet, yeah. What does intersectionality mean in that context?
So I use intersectionality inspired by Kimberly Crenshaw's work in critical race theory. And intersectionality is something that she uses as a method of analysis and a political organizing strategy. So she's talking about the ways that there are intersecting structures of oppression that impact different people in different ways simultaneously. And a lot of times the institutions and social structures for welfare and support that we've erected only serve in silos. So she gives this example that I really love of an undocumented Spanish speaker who is the survivor of domestic violence. And the shelters that she goes to looking for refuge only take English speakers. They don't have capacity. So then she has nowhere to go. And it's because she's at the intersections of multiple systems of oppression, and we don't create institutions to accommodate people in their wholeness, in their whole selves. We kind of compartmentalize and break people down, and that has to do with funding streams and interests and philanthropic funding and charismatic figures that bring our focus to some issues but not others. And also just our medical industry bifurcating the body into, oh, well, if you have workers' comp for your hands, but actually the pain is coming from your back, we will not pay for your back. We will only pay for your hands, right? Those kinds of compartmentalizations exist in social welfare as well. And so intersectionality, I think, is a really important way to begin to take seriously the ways that individuals can be impacted by multiple structures of oppression from different directions simultaneously with their own histories, and requires different kinds of support.
Well, not to totally narrow down just on one silo then, but I do want to talk to you about specifically the experiences of women in some of our institutions and specifically our justice system.
That's right.
And I was wondering if you could paint a picture a little bit of the precedent that currently exists for how we deal with violence towards women and domestic violence towards women.
Absolutely. So your question is, what is the relationship between women and justice, and what are the challenges? There's so many.
Yeah.
So women are among the highest growing population of incarcerated folks. People often focus on men in prison because the numbers are so much, much larger. But one of the things Angela Davis talks about in her public talks frequently is that we must be paying attention to the impact of these institutions on those who live on the margins of these institutions. And so looking at the conditions of women actually gives you so much insight into the justice system's inability to keep people safe and to keep justice accessible to those who need it most. And one of those issues has to do with representation. We still have all of these wild representations of women in prison that are so spectacularized and gratuitous and hypersexualized. I was doing some research in the 1970s surrounding the uprising at Attica. I was just curious what else was happening in the culture at that time. So I was looking through newspapers and found this ad for Big Dollhouse. And you can see in the ad for the film, these women are in a cage. And the cage is almost like a bird cage. It's suspended, and they are spilling out of it with their limbs and their scantily cladness. And this was an image that was just a few pages away from the accounts of the uprising at Attica. And I couldn't help but think about the fact that our kind of collective understanding of what happens in prison, what happens to women in prison, and what kind of women are in prison and why they're there is so distant from the reality. And it's intentionally so. It's very difficult to have your voice heard from behind bars, particularly if you've been convicted of something violent. Your credibility is at stake. All of the things that make you kind of cohere as a valuable contributor to your society as a woman have been taken away from you. Your children have been taken away from you. Your relationships to family and work. And the real story doesn't get heard. And that's just the optics. The real frightening piece to me about seeking justice as a woman is that self-defense is just very rarely seen as a complex context of survival in a domestic space. So if you have a way out, if you could have left, you are held culpable. If you had a choice according to some idea of reasonable doubt, then you can be held culpable. So in the case of Marissa Alexander, which is the one that I have been sitting with the most recently, Alyssa Bieri is an academic who presents on her a lot. And one of the things that Alyssa taught me is that because there was an opportunity for her to leave the house, and it was clear that she was on her way out but came back in. And then he said the provocative, "I'm going to kill you." And then she fired the warning shot into the ceiling.
No one was hurt.
And no one was hurt. And she did it because her kids were in the car. And she had had an instance earlier, and this is what these kinds of legal spaces often are unable to take into consideration for all kinds of different reasons that I don't understand. So there had been a previous case where she had left the house, and he followed her, and he beat her in the street. And so she knew that if she left the house with him not feeling like she was serious, he would follow her, and she wanted to protect her kids. And so she wanted to make sure he didn't follow her, and so she shot the warning shot. And those kinds of complexities, the history of the relationship, the history of the abuse, the degree to which there's more to protect than yourself, all of those things are things that the court can't take into consideration as easily because self-defense law, as I understand it, has a precedent in these relationships of autonomous contestation between two equal individuals. And it's about the preservation of property, one's things, one's body. And if we take seriously the history of rape culture in this country, there has not been protection for women's rights to their bodies since the beginning of the legal justice system here on this land. It's always been the right and the prerogative of those in power to do with what they wish without consequence, largely. And so we're still sitting in the muck of that omission of protection. And it's being reinforced through the law in all these ways that make it really difficult for survivors of domestic violence to find justice. Survivors of transphobic attacks, of homophobic attacks. It's very difficult to discern what's going on because the culture is one of suspicion rather than of believing victims.
I think it's crazy that there's even this idea that the onus is on the woman or the person that's being abused to leave. Like, the conversation is not how do we remove the predator. It's like, why didn't she leave?
That's right. And it's a surprising interpretation, but it's one that's prevalent. I was teaching in California, and one of my classes was focused on women in the law, women in politics. And I was teaching them about Anita Hill. And after, laying out the history of Anita Hill's law background and ascent, they said, why didn't she just get a different job? Why wouldn't she just leave the job? There are so many different ways in which entitlement is accepted with particular populations and expected. And there are those of us for whom it's just seen like, oh, you just keep it moving. If you can't make your way in the world, in this space, in this job, in this relationship, just find another. All of a sudden, it seems like infinite possibility is the best refuge, as opposed to changing the structures and paradigms, like you said, actually holding perpetrators accountable, holding institutions accountable, holding the law accountable for not allowing that to take place in these situations.
I feel like I read a statistic that something like 3/4 of the women incarcerated have been victims of domestic abuse.
It sounds about right.
So what happens to these women who are in jail? Like, what is their reality?
On a day-to-day?
Yeah, and just their trajectory. I mean, obviously there's no real resources or support or even rehabilitation happening in that case. Like, it seems like they're probably going from violence at home to violence in prison, and then what is life after that?
It's variable. I don't have a whole lot of personal experience working with women coming out of the system. And the information that I have about what happens inside, I have some personal experience. I worked in a women's prison as an undergrad in college doing poetry workshops with the women inside, which was a really incredibly powerful experience. Mostly they were missing their children, they were missing their families, and they were worried about not being able to get them back once they were out. The kind of upward climb that you have to overcome when you get out is pretty steep in terms of you can't have your kids back until you have a job, and getting a job without a place to stay. And sometimes there's halfway houses and things like this, but all of it is really unfamiliar territory. And it's not the way that folks have figured out how to survive before. And so not only are they having to adjust from being in prison, but they're also having to learn a whole new system of livelihood and accountability that I would imagine would be really challenging to subject oneself to. Yeah.
So I guess from more of a zoomed out perspective, would you be able to speak on sort of what the intention of these systems are? Like, why does the prison system exist in the way that it does? Like, why are more women being arrested? Is this all driven by profits?
It's driven by a lot of different things intersecting, a lot of different interests intersecting simultaneously. It's not like there are one set of interests that are driving these rates. Mass incarceration is a complex. There's a lot of folks who focus on the problem of mass incarceration in and of itself, but the problem of mass incarceration happens within a context of prison industrial complex, just the landscape of carceral logics, security state, patriarchy, nationalism, all cohere. And one of the things that has been really surprising is how powerful correction officers' unions are, how powerful police officers are as political interests who are not going to be interested in looking at alternatives. There is the profit piece, but at this point, taxpayers are paying a lot more to support and house individuals in prisons than they are supporting higher ed in California, I think is one of the statistics that I've heard. So there are people profiting, but not across the board, which is why I think there's bipartisan support for thinking about things like prison reform and thinking about things like overcrowding. But that's why also a lot of the solutions become privatization and not really looking at the root causes. So many of the root causes have to do with poverty, employment, healthcare, substance support. It's brass tacks, housing, food, and shelter issues that would really change the need for policing in prisons from the ground up. And we don't have a lot of support for that kind of infrastructure.
Yes.
Repair.
Yes.
There's a thread of narrative that I think connects cultures of racial injustice to cultures of incarcerating women who are survivors of domestic violence, to blaming survivors of sexual assault for wearing the wrong thing or being in the wrong place or being a flirt or something like this. And from welfare to domestic violence to rape culture, blame the victim narratives persist. And this thinking around individual responsibility for your own safety always trumps narratives of accountability being imposed on the political communities and infrastructures that we inhabit. And I don't understand why we have such an aversion to structural analysis in these instances, but have such a robust one when it comes to the market crisis or larger systemic issues that result in enhanced technologies of collective self-incarceration, build a wall, ripping families apart, seeing children as threats, all these very complex solutions all of a sudden seem available when it's the nation in distress and not populations within the nation.
But what is the nation then at that point if it's not the people of the nation? Like, what are we even defending?
An idea. And in that way, in the study of slavery and the study of these movements for civil rights in the 1960s and 70s, we're really good at protecting ideas. Really not great at protecting people. And that goes for white, cis, heterosexual men as well. We're really bad at protecting our veterans. We're really bad at we're really bad at protecting our citizens through the healthcare system. I just had a friend tell me people looked at her like we are all Nazis in this country for the way that we don't care for our citizens through the healthcare system. That it's that kind of disregard for humanity that is represented in that. So it's been useful for me to begin to think about all the ways in which the country fails to care for its citizens and think about how we can be aware of that impact on our lives as individuals, on our bodies, on our ways of taking care of each other. How does the fact that we learn care as this kind of administrative, bureaucratic,
externalized
elimination of a problem, How does that then filter down, even if we say we want to do more, how does that filter down into our interpersonal relationships with each other, our ways of taking care of ourselves? To what degree have kind of the medical industrial complex, the military industrial complex, and the prison industrial complex, bureaucracy, really filled our imaginations and desires for care in ways that make it hard for us to even notice when we're not doing the thing that we think we're doing as we're doing it. And I think it's happening all the time. So the way that I teach prison abolition and the problem with prisons is to not further exacerbate the perception that prisons are far, far away, or I'm in an elite institution, or that the people that the prison impacts are so different from the people in the classroom. I'm really trying to help folks see how those institutions that operate on people that are not us and in spaces that we can't see have a direct impact on how we treat ourselves, each other, and how we negotiate for justice in this world, because we're still relying on the kinds of logics that those institutions emit, legitimize, and make seem like common sense.
That idea that if everyone is not free, no one is free.
Essentially, your liberation is bound up in mine.
Yeah. How do you see that internalization playing out in interpersonal relationships?
So there has always been this intense amount of competition in academia. And so part of what I'm trying to do is see how that intense culture of competition that's kind of anticipated and expected on Wall Street or in corporate contexts really begins we begin to being acculturated to it in college or even in the pursuit of getting into college in these education systems. And it's reinforced by grade point averages and SAT scores and access to outside tutors for these standardized tests and the kind of political economy that makes it more possible for you to access those things if you're in a particular class status. And if you're not, it creates a culture of competition amongst people who are already highly advantaged, and it creates a context of apathy, and you're never going to get anywhere in places where those resources don't exist. So there's that. And then that gets reinforced in all kinds of other ways socially. So even on the left, we compete with each other to be the most down in our movements. We compete with each other to be the most real and hard-lined in our politics. I put my body on the line. I go to every protest. And an idea that there is a more authentic way to be an activist, and we're weaponizing knowledge and wielding it against each other in ways that cut people down and cut people out. How could you not know this? How could you not have read this? How could you not know who Angela Davis is? Instead of having it be an opportunity to call in. So Callout Culture, I think, is a really insidious reverberation from post 9/11, if you see something, say something culture.
Wow.
And I don't think it's an accident that those kind of millennial generations that were coming of age in a post 9/11 world were perhaps unwittingly reproducing that logic, even in the critique of the country itself. Right? In the critique of colonialism and militarism, heteropatriarchy, we're still saying, if you see something, say something. And so Callout Culture is this way of, I see you haven't worked through your white supremacy. I see you haven't worked through your ableism. I see you haven't done the work to be fully woke. And so I'm going to police you until you come correct. And so we are reproducing these things. And when people make mistakes and people aren't where we are at, we have no time for them. We shut them out and we see them as disposable. And there is no coming back from that, I've noticed, for a lot of people. So once they get policed and punished for not being X degree of woke, they kind of give up. And it can be really toxic in terms of producing alt-right sentiment, producing all of this backlash that becomes equally polarized in an opposite direction. And I think we don't even know when we're doing that call-out culture that that's what we're laying the foundation for. But in fact, that's been seen time and time again. You know, and this isn't just a moment that's particular to now. This happened during the 1960s and 70s too, when Snick closed ranks and became Black only, people of color only. The white folks who had been working with them don't necessarily just like fall into allyship models. There are hurt feelings when you get cut out. And I think being able to see the connection between what's wrong with incarceration and what's wrong with cutting people out and what's wrong with building a wall and what's wrong with detention. I mean, when you start to see these patterns failing in multiple contexts, you have to assume perhaps it's the practice that's the problem. Perhaps we need to figure out better ways to work through conflict, stay at the table, continue our connection with each other, even as we're in disagreement, even as we've incurred harm or perpetuated harm, and sit with that instead of shutting it down, shutting it out, and locking it up and throwing it away. Because we're bypassing really important moments of connection and feeling and healing in that act, in that practice. And so we're, you know, experiencing right now kind of an explosion of this repressed, unresolved, unprocessed emotion, I think, around grief, around separation, desire for connection, and repeated instances of alienation.
That, like you said, is the root of everything in this country, it seems to be. Is what you're describing, is that radical Dharma?
It's connected to radical Dharma for sure, because if we're protecting an idea and we're not protecting ourselves, we're protecting an idea to the deficit of our own health and connection with each other, then we're not being present to what's actually happening. And that is a willful ignorance that meditation, radical Dharma is meant to disrupt. I'm really excited about all the different ways contemplative practice can make us realize what's actually happening in the moment and change and respond, or at least try to respond in an earnest way that's not this kind of habituated, conditioned culture of bypassing what's really happening for people.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you, you know, where we turn when our institutions are fundamentally oppressive and we can no longer look to them for healing or education or even protection. You know, if we're saying like the police are not necessarily there to like protect marginalized people, where do we look for functional models? It sounds like maybe Buddhism has offered some that have been useful to you.
Maybe not Buddhism as
a monolith.
Yeah, but maybe my experiences in a Sangha. So a Sangha is a kind of group, a congregation of folks who are practicing together and living and working together in some instances. In the instance that I had the honor of being a part of in Berkeley. I also get a lot of my inspiration from history. One of the people that I am deeply inspired by and moved by is Harriet Jacobs. And reading her Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl that was published the same year that the U.S. went to war against itself is every time I return to it, there's something new I find about what it means to be living in a hostile landscape in which the institutions that are most powerful are not interested in your survival. What do you do in those instances? So if we take it to this hyperbolic historical example of slavery, what did people do in order to experience something other than subjection? What do they turn if they can't trust the institutions that are, erected around them? They turn to each other. They turn to each other. And so there's a part in Radical Dharma where I'm talking about racial justice and how we are kind of herded into the work of abolishing white supremacy and abolishing racial injustice. And so many times it's a herding that re-subjects us to this paradigm of permission. Like, who should we turn to? We need an appeal to someone above us. But if everyone above you is the problem, then the metaphor I use is that if you're on a platform waiting for the train going towards this progressive place of racial equality or racial justice, right? And so what are you doing on that platform? You're looking to see when the next train is coming. You're looking to the institution, the context, the infrastructure that you're inhabiting in order to see how to get to where you're going, because you trust that it will be able to get you there still, even though you know that the landscape you're in is built by the very thing that you're trying to eradicate. And so I say, what if we just turn to each other on that platform instead of waiting for the next train or trying to find different routes? What if we turn to each other and begin to really talk with each other about how we are all, and this is Radical Dharma up and down, how we are all impacted by the perpetuation of these incredible injustices of prison industrial complex, of U.S. empire, of heteropatriarchy, of rape culture, of white supremacy. Not a one of us is uninjured, is left untouched. Even folks who are quote unquote supposed to be benefiting from it, even folks who we have this language of privilege are privileged within it, are hurt by it. And that's why that language of privilege, I think, is really not helpful because it makes it seem like the benefits of white supremacy are desirable to us all. And I refuse that narrative. I do not want to be the beneficiary of white supremacy. That would not make it better.
Well said, yeah.
It would just mean that I was now putting my foot on someone else's neck in ways that I was excused and pardoned for. And that's already happening as an American. That's already happening as someone who's college educated and has access to these institutions of learning. My foot is already on other people's necks. And I would prefer that to not be celebrated or seen as success. I think that really needs to be interrogated as our ethical accountability to do something with our power, to do something with our access, to redistribute wealth and knowledge. And
yeah. So this is not, I'm not asking you for like policy necessarily, but sort of from a pragmatic point of view, in order to make real shifts. Just taking even abolition for an example, I feel like that word can be really scary to people because people imagine like the doors to the jail opening and all the bad guys rushing out. Right. It's like, what does it look like to have a society where abolition is truly possible? Like, do we have to burn down what we have right now and build something radically new? How is it possible to get towards practical abolition?
This is something that I think about a lot. And what it really comes down to is how do we shift? How do we shift? And I think transition is traumatic, always. We're always going to mourn the ways that we used to be, even if they weren't really working for us. And that is definitely coming from personal experience. We've just been talking about all the ways you have to change your eating behavior in order to accommodate this landscape of genetically modified foods that are wreaking havoc on our systems and inflaming all of our bits. And, you know, that's one of the least traumatic transitions I've had to make. And it's still hard. So as someone who has, I've had a sitting meditation practice for about 20 years. And I've had to give up a lot of what was not working for me as a result of that practice. And it's not easy. And it's also not singular. It's not linear. So it's a practice. And it's a practice that you increase in capacity at the longer that you do it. And so not relying on violence to keep us safe would have to become a practice on a personal level before it could really take hold politically. We need to work on it in our communities. We need to work on it in our families. We are constantly relying on violence to keep us safe in multiple kinds of punitive technologies in our relationships.
Explain that a little bit?
Sure. So punishing people for hurting your feelings by taking away your friendship. Just in small ways like that.
Such a shift, yeah.
And so being aware of the ways that we use aggression. And so I'll switch to aggression from violence, because violence seems like you have very kind of physical and interpersonal, perhaps, connotations with the perpetuations of violence. But aggression is something that works at the level of culture, at the level of behavior, at the level of language. And I don't know that we're always conscious of the ways that we are using aggression to keep us safe, but we are. And we're, animals at the end of the day. And we're constantly trying to survey our environments for potential threats. And some of those threats have to do with, identity and status and very ephemeral things. And so the things that we've learned to protect ourselves from and the ways that we've learned to protect ourselves are super socially constructed and have all this historical context. And we do it without thinking, the woman clutching her purse in the elevator or something like we do it without thinking. It's instinctual. And so at the level of instinct, we need to be in practice.
Wow.
Right. And that is going to take a minute. So I'm really interested in the work that Patrisse Cullors is doing, this book that she wrote in response to the FBI report about Black identity extremists working through Black Lives Matter in ways that were being deemed terrorism, prompted her to write a book called When They Call You a Terrorist. And it details her trajectory of organizing from her community in LA to the rise of Black Lives Matter. And it's not direct. She makes mistakes. She calls the cops. She relies on them, and she details what happens when that happens and what harm it brings to her family, to her brother in particular. And after that happens, she realizes she has to come up with another way. One of the big challenges with social change work is that because we learn history in these big kind of epic ruptures, moments of rupture, and then after that, we didn't do that anymore, right? Like this kind of romanticized, heroic narrative of transformation that's about one man and one day and one act, right? And it's really not ever the case that goes down like that. It's always the case that there's more than one man, that there's a whole bunch of people, and that typically they're driven by women, and that there are some wins and there are some setbacks, and that even when we win, we have to reteach ourselves what we were fighting for after we gained that win, because the tendency is to forget because it was so traumatizing to get there. There are so many kind of incremental pieces of the process of change that we erase from the narrative of social change, from social justice movements. And that's what we need back. Because we're not forgiving ourselves for the time that it takes to actually transform. We are impatient, and we want it to have happened already, and it doesn't work like that. You don't quite know when you're done. And you just have to keep practicing.
Maybe you're never done. I don't know.
Maybe you're never done. And I have a feeling that might be the work. It's Rachel Herzig, whom I met at Critical Resistance. Critical Resistance is a national organizing movement for prison abolition. And Rachel Herzig said, in my Prison Industrial Complex Training 101 and my Abolitionist Training 101, abolition is a long-term solution with practical steps along the way. And I think that combination of prophetic vision and pragmatic application is central to the way I see this work moving. So instead of imagining it be like, oh, prison walls fall now, deal, though I have a feeling even that project would go down differently than we imagine. It would be something like, while we work on limiting the expansion of prisons and our reliance on police to keep us safe, let's also be investing in community resilience building. Let's also be addressing rape culture in our schools. Let's also be finding alternatives to calling the police when instances of harm come up in our families and communities. Does it mean that we have to then create time for building relationships with the people that we live around? Whew, what a scary prospect that is. For me personally, the person across the street who comes in with a Dixieland beep, like as he's pulling into his driveway, it's not someone that I want to really have to be in relationship with in order to bypass reliance on the police. And yet that is where the work is. That's where the work is.
It's so vulnerable.
It is so vulnerable. And, I think a lot of my white students who are interested in doing anti-racism work, after they take my class, they're like, Yasmin, the thing that I'm learning most about this work is coming from just talking to my family. And I said, yeah, that's the whole point, is that if you can't talk to your crazy racist Uncle Bob and you can't create space for that conversation in your life, then we're certainly not going to be able to do this on a much larger scale. And that's really what it's going to take, is us shifting our ethical accountability to those who are around us and saying, oh, you're not just in the way, you're not just a problem to be shut down, shut out, or disposed of, but I'm accountable to you. These relationships are important and can change. And hopefully there's something of kinship there enough to hold space for conflict and potentially for listening and sharing and healing.
I hope so.
Me too.
I've been thinking about this a lot in relation to sort of the public figureheads who are responsible for policies right now that are overtly racist and scary, that I think we're all responding to in this moment. But I also sort of have become very disenchanted with talking about those people, because it feels like this really easy way to kind of externalize like the face of evil. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you, because you have this personal practice in the Dharma, if you have a sense of like how to think about people that we think are kind of the face of the state or the man who are personally culpable for perpetuating these things. Like, are those people that we should be working to see as humans so that we can engage with in these ways? Are these people that are suffering on the inside as well, so they're perpetuating things they're not even entirely aware of? Like, how do we position evilness in this picture?
As everywhere at once.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think that particularly with someone like Barack Obama, there's a lot of desire to not... I mean, I think this is the moment for this question. Mm-hmm. Originally, there's a lot of desire to see him as the hero, right? As the kind of deus ex machina coming in from Chicago to save us all and
Yeah.
deliver us into a post-racial future. And he couldn't do that. Why? Because he was a product of his environment. He had already been educated in ways that reinforced neoliberal logics and saw them as superior to all other forms of political economic intervention. He still harbored an incredible amount of American exceptionalism, which meant that his ability to hold America accountable was obscured by that bias. It is difficult for people in those positions to act outside of the kind of habituated behaviors that they've been trained and incentivized and rewarded for performing so well. So I don't really see, honestly, that much difference between the ones that we are readily able to demonize and those that are supposed to just have not been living up to our expectations. They seem pretty much the same to me. And that's a hard thing to say.
That's a pretty radical thing to say in these times.
It is. But it's also about compassion for my own conditioning. It's very difficult to act other than the ways that you were raised and to see those ways as wayward and to walk away from them. It's hard. And so I don't want to make excuses for them. It's not like that. It's more like I understand how this culture produced you. Because I understand how this culture produced me. And we just all have a lot of work to do. And some people are going to be more likely to walk away than others. And I think those folks who have been so deeply rewarded for so long for being exactly who they are going to be very, very difficult to shift. Because what incentive do they have to do so? Even if they have a feeling of being out of integrity inside of themselves, it seems like it would be a tough sell. It seems like it'd be a tough sell, which is why I really love working with young people, because young people are still, to some degree, many of them, are still searching for what it is that is going to drive them, what is that they're going to allow to shape them. And there is a little window of opportunity in college to introduce a multiplicity of avenues of possibility so that once they're out there, even though tradition, family, class, all these things will probably sweep them along in a very predictable kind of way, they might inhabit those spaces differently than they would have otherwise. And I think that's really the best way to think about it. So going back to the context of slavery, one of the things that Harriet Jacobs has taught me is that you can inhabit oppressive systems in unconventional ways. And when you do that, and we can do that in community with others, it can change the relationality, the sociality of the experience of subjection, of the experience of oppression for the oppressor. And that I think is really our way out right now, which means there is no way out. There's just like a way to transform from the inside out. And we can't ask for permission. We can't be looking for appreciations for that. We really have to look to each other and find new ways of relationality.
Yeah, if we keep waiting for the example, it's like the help is not coming from the outside.
The calls are going to come from inside the house.
Yeah.
In a good way, not in a horror way, hopefully.
Yeah.
But I think that's it, is that we actually don't know how to do this. This actually hasn't really been done like this before. We've been a very herded, shepherded kind of people. And that has gotten us where we are. And I think we just need to be a lot more self-realized, a lot more self-actualized, practicing much more discernment within ourselves about what it means to be in choice and in integrity.
Yeah, because you are so well versed in sort of the history of this, do you feel like we've been sort of repeating the same things over and over? Because sometimes I feel scared, I guess, when feeling the opportunity of this moment for real change, of being like, we've been here before. You know, Anita Hill, we've seen this. Even going back to like the witch trials, like
That's
there's a
right.
cycle here. Do you feel like there's a trajectory?
I think it's been cyclical. I think we've been in recursive relationships to violence and trauma. I think that the transitions that we think we've had haven't been complete. And so the unfinished work of the ending of slavery, the unfinished work of the ending of lynch culture, the unfinished work of civil rights movement and the women's rights movement and gay liberation are still with us. And we are still bearing the wounds of those traumas, of the genocide of indigenous peoples on this land who are still here and whom we still marginalize, right? So I think the erasure of women's agency since the beginning, as we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, has not been healed. We're still suffering from it. And so the reason it feels recursive, the reason it feels cyclical, is because we're not done and we haven't been complete in our repair of those injuries. And we want to have been. So there's two things, right? There's like the wound, and then there's the neglect of the wound, the willful ignorance of the wound, and both of those things are injurious. And so I think this desire to be heard, to be recognized as survivors of these continual historical racialized gendered violence is part of the healing. I think it's really important to tell our stories and keep our own account of what counts and share those testimonies amongst each other so that we don't feel alone. But I also think that the kind of wound healing that's at the core really has to do with those who have quote unquote privilege and power. As if we're only treating those quote unquote survivors, then what is our accountability to those who are perpetuating harm? And do we believe that they can change, or do we want to do to them what they've done to us, lock them up, throw away the key? I don't think that's the answer. I don't think that's easy, because there are fathers, husbands, like there are people oftentimes, and as soon as you sever that relationship, you're going to be wounded by it as well. So I think what we're really trying to do right now is shift our relationship to what it means to be in relationship to each other, to the land, to our food, to the future, to our understanding of the past, and care about it in ways that don't just privilege ideology, but really privilege our collective welfare and the survival of our traditions and cultures and practices of survival. It does feel like we're on the verge of something really different.
It feels like the stakes are really high to set what that different is going to be, if it's going to be catastrophic or if it could be a real new way.
And it might be both, but it'll probably be both given what's going on. But I do think that one of the things technology gives us is the ability to see, almost as like a palimpsest, all these failed movements, right? To be able to look into the past and see the merits and the failures of the French Revolution, the merits and the failures of American independence, the merits and the failures of the Civil War and civil rights movement. Like, we can kind of see them in this way that is material. On the internet, we can kind of see it in its mirror within a mirror within a mirror embeddedness in a way that I think you couldn't when you were dealing with like a card catalog and the stacks of books. There's a relationality to it in a material book form that makes it seem still. And there's something about the internet, I think, I don't know, because you know, I got my first email address in college, right? So I think my ability to interact with information in this kind of way really only happened once the internet existed. But my impression is that the fact that we can kind of travel so quickly between time periods and archives through digital means, through digital research, means that we're just thinking about it. We're experiencing it in a different kind of way. And I think the awareness that, people have made the same mistakes over and over and over. How do we anticipate this work as generative of these kinds of mistakes? And how do we incorporate that into our strategies instead of being surprised when we run into them? Right?
Yeah. It feels like technology is on this tipping point, too, where there's a moment where it could become just another tool of the institutions that are oppressing us in the same ways, or are we really going to protect its democratizing potential? Which is, scary, too. Could go either way, or both. Well, I wonder if you have any practical advice for someone that wants to shift their, just in the scope of their conversation with themselves and the people in their immediate communities, if there are some first steps that we can take. Because, taking on injustice can feel so abstract and impossible. But I feel like you have some keys to where to start.
The things that have been really powerful for me have been spaces that integrate contemplative practice, embodied practice, intellectual histories and activist histories of liberation, real deep reading with narratives of overcoming adversity, slave narratives, Malcolm X's narrative, Assata Shakur, Angela Davis, those folks, and then collaborative practices. So the radical Dharma work that we have done with my co-authors, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, who is a sensei in the Zen tradition, and Lama Rod Owens, who is a Tibetan teacher. What we've been doing, so we wrote a book together called Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation. And instead of just letting it remain a book and leave y'all to your best devices for implementing it, we've developed a bunch of programming. So we come together sometimes it's just us as individuals doing this programming, but the Radical Dharma programs are really great ways of beginning to integrate. I think for me personally, what happened was that once I was living with my teacher and co-author, Reverend Angel, not for that long, like 3 months, but and for intermittent periods of time, I would just stop by and stay for a week or so, is that I could not hide the ways that I was being aggressive or violent there, because I was in practice always, right? So I was in practice in the practice hall, but I was also in practice with those same people when we were cleaning the house and doing dishes and managing chores, and also when we were doing the programming and promoting the center as a nonprofit. And also when we were out together socially. So at some point, I mean, most of us are pretty good at putting on our best face and being on our best behavior in particular instances, like at work or in the public eye. But there's some place where we get messy and where we get aggressive. For me, it's probably home, because I had such a contentious relationship with my parents as a preacher's kid, and being like, I don't want to practice religion, not as long as you're under my roof, that became the space where I was the most aggressive. And so then when I was in practice with Reverend Angel, the place where I would notice my aggression wasn't usually in the practice hall during a prayer or something. There I'm on my best behavior. I'm ringing the bells. I'm doing the bows. I'm doing the things right. It's about washing dishes. It's about something completely innocuous, but then you get to see your pattern. And once you get to see your pattern, you get to see how it's low key working in all those other places, but you've learned to manage it in ways that are socially acceptable. And if you really want to shift, you have to be able to see and embrace the fact that sometimes you're not the nicest person.
Some radical honesty there.
Some radical honesty. And so I think the kinds of spaces that we create are kind of mini situations like that, where we give you a lot of space to integrate the way you are with yourself, the way you are with your partner, people, your family, the way you are with your employment at work. And if there are patterns that aren't working for you that you think are just about your boss being crazy or just about your teenager being, disobedient or something. But then in this space, you start to see that, no, it's not just that relationship, that it's a pattern that exists in a much broader way, then you can start to shift. Wow. And so I'm interested in bringing those kinds of 360-degree practice spaces into my classroom, into my LGBTQ organizing work here in the Hudson Valley, into the radical Dharma spaces. And so those kinds of spaces are great places for people to come and participate. There are programs happening throughout the summer, and you can just go on Radical Dharma and see. You can also go on Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams' webpage. She has them up. I don't have a webpage yet. That kind of marketing is not yet my modus operandi, but I'm trying. It's coming. But those are great. And the 5 principles that are kind of central to that work are contemplative approach, embodied practice, liberatory path, which has to do with these traditions and intellectual and activist cultures of movement building, prophetic praxis, which for me is really about this kind of internal discernment and noticing in your body when things don't line up. Oh, this is new information. A lot of times we bypass it instead of paying attention to it. And the more we can learn to pay attention to it, the more we can tell what time it is and act accordingly. And so I really see that as a practice rooted in spirituality and prophetic traditions.
So it's like the information is already in there, but we have to learn how to hear it.
How to hear it and how to read it and how to pay attention and respond. And sometimes it's really in an instant, right? And I think there's some aspects of us that are really good at that. I remember being in a conversation in a classroom that felt like I just need to go. And I couldn't really articulate why. Much after, I could say, oh, it was because they were being really reductive about their conversation about race and class. And it was feeling unsafe for me to even speak in that room. So I just left. But there are moments when your body is like, yeah, I gotta go. And that's most clear analogy. But there's also times that, you're not supposed to eat that thing. You're like, something's telling me don't eat that, right? Like, so how do you become more attuned to those kind of instincts, kind of the sixth sense? But it's also physiological. And sometimes people's caginess is palpable in your body before you even have a narrative in your head as to why you don't really want to be vulnerable with them or trust them or whatever it is. And so beginning to have that kind of discernment at the level of our relationship with institutions, our relationship with ideologies, our integrity with working towards social justice, not leaving people behind just because it's advantageous, to creating a winnable moment or something like that, right? Yeah. There's all kinds of ways where we can start moving away from what's actually happening to the preservation of an idea of what should be happening that get us in trouble always. And so prophetic praxis is about being in greater integrity with what's actually going on.
I'm sure that makes you more aware, too, of how the institutions are telling you to turn that off or to not listen to that. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And you have to be careful because sometimes it's important to, do what they say. But you can always do what they say in ways that are really still maintaining your own awareness of what's going on. I don't think people could have survived slavery without that kind of negotiation.
Yes.
Right. So that kind of constant rebellion of my adolescence is something I've had to unlearn. That maybe fighting power at every instance isn't always the most sustainable practice. It can be really detrimental to your own sense of, calm and integrity. So yeah, I'm really excited about those things. Oh, and the last one is so it's contemplative path, embodied practice, liberatory approach, prophetic praxis and collective process. So much of our language around self-care reinforces that isolated personal responsibility of the self, and we don't roll with that really well. You do your thing, you fight for a little while, and then you fall off. Why? Because it's not happening. You need a buddy to go to the gym. You need classes. You need a coach, right? Like in every other instance of learning, it's collective. You have a classroom, you have a teacher, you have books, you have disciplines. Like we have all these collective ways of doing this in every other instance of learning. But self-care, you're supposed to pretty much person alone. And that doesn't make any sense.
Or you're a bad person if you can't hack it that way.
That's right. That's right. And there's so much punitive punishment that goes along, judginess that goes along with that failure to, like, or perception of failure to keep up with your self-care practices. So what does it mean for it to be collective? It means you're going to have to be vulnerable in your failure to the witness of others. Oh no. But they're going to do it too. So it's about really creating more than just individual responsibility and creating collective responsibility for our work towards liberation, our work towards the end of global oppression and racial injustice, gender violence. It's really about also being vulnerable about the ways that we failed to move that work forward. And supporting each other when that happens and being able to lean on each other. I'm not strong enough today. Right? Today, my heart is too broken. Today, I'm just too mad. Instead of externalizing that limitation and putting it on others in ways that shut them down or judge them or make it more difficult for them to show up the next time just because it was hard for you to show up today. I will not go into details as to what I'm thinking of there.
Fair
you know
enough.
who you are.
This is not Callout Culture.
No.
Well, thank you so much for the work that you do, because already just in this conversation, I feel like immensely more, it just feels more possible and hopeful. And I can see how to start to look for the pathways that will take us somewhere better, and or not even to look for them, but like to generate them and be part of them. So yeah, I'm really grateful, so grateful that you're doing this work and making it so available. It's like very needed.
We need places to experiment with what it means to not rely on these old practices, because it's hard for us to just like willy-nilly try something new, and that's fair. So that's really what those spaces are about, like radical Dharma spaces.
Where it's okay to fail, you're saying?
Where it's okay to fail. Yeah, and I try to make sure that my classroom is like that. I try to make sure I create collaborative processes that are about that, but it's incredibly challenging because folks are so habituated towards this kind of winner-take-all mentality. And so people's ways of preserving themselves in the midst of conflict is mastery, which means subjection of others. And that's hard to retrain.
Well, and we feel so under threat all the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Those are the tools we have to use.
Yeah.
And yes, they're draconian, but they're working for us.
Right.
And so, even on the left, right? So I'm really interested in giving people places to experiment with failure. I asked my partner on the way home last night, do you think it's a good idea to give the students who asked for an extension extra points to reward them for asking for what they need? And my partner was like, yeah, you can't do that. But I wanted to do so. I would like to be in a world in which you are rewarded not only for turning things in on time and being a good student and doing your homework, but also for asking for what you need when that deadline isn't going to work for you, or it's going to like create a particular kind of strain on your mental or physical health, or you just wanted to take care of yourself in a different kind of way. I think we need to be able to incentivize those things too, and maybe not through a grade point average, but
like rewarding people for seeing themselves as not just part of the system.
Right, and for seeing themselves as like, there is so much apology, like dramatic apology in these emails that we're working towards an extension, wanting an extension. And I'd really like us to let that go, right? like, can we let that heaviness go? Because whatever you're carrying that's already made it impossible for you to meet that deadline is probably heavy enough. Instead of having to carry this extra burden of, I'm so sorry I was unable to meet the expectations. Like,
it's that shame culture.
the shame culture is just an extra layer of anxiety that is unnecessary. Can we come up with a different structure of feeling that accompanies failure to meet an expectation, right? That has more to do with repairing whatever led to that failure, as opposed to inviting punishment for having failed. Which has direct implications, obviously, not just with my midterm deadline, but with incarceration itself.
And to never try again to do it a different way if you might
right.
possibly risk that punishment again.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great to be in conversation.
You guys, I'm so grateful that you joined for this conversation today. Isn't she an amazing teacher? Could you imagine having her in college, having that perspective and energy in your 20-year-old brain? And if you're in college now and listening to this and she's your professor, I'm so excited about who you're going to be out in the world after school. You can find her book, Radical Dharma, everywhere that books are found. And you can find more Unbroken Chain podcasts at my website, marajames.com, and all your friendly neighborhood podcast purveyors. I love Yasmin's idea of experimenting and making your relationships, making your life your laboratory. And I really want to encourage you to play with the generative magic of your intuition and your intention and see what kind of energy and action you can manifest in the arc of your own life. The sphere of your influence will just continue to bloom, and you'll see the universe conspiring to help you get free. And I just want to echo her core belief to be so sweet on yourself. Give yourself the compassion that you would so readily give to your lover. Because we aren't useful to ourselves, and we are certainly not useful to one another from a place of shame. Likewise, we can be so powerful in relieving one another. I talked to a friend this week about how I've been really hating my body and feeling trapped in myself in ways that feel regressive, feel like a version of myself that I grew out of and I am way beyond, and was of course keeping myself trapped in the very negative feelings that I didn't want to be experiencing just by telling myself that I shouldn't be there and judging the entire worth of my life based on the fact that I was revisiting dips that I have no doubt will continue to dip for the rest of my life. And just in being able to say it out loud to her in the invitation that she created with her own experience that she was sharing, and just being able to admit to myself that I was having a hard time was really the first step in shifting that energy from deeper self-loathing into something productive, closer to humor, closer to being able to laugh at myself and be like, oh, look at you, you're in that hole again. Whoops. So call someone this week. Reach out if you need help remembering that you're not alone. You are so loved, and your life is so worthwhile. You are part of the solution. Your magic is real, and we need you here. I love you. Take care of one another, and I'll see you out there.